How's that?
Perfect.
Better. Okay, good. Good afternoon, everyone.
Started as soon as we're waiting for Counselor Campbell, right?
She's joining now.
Okie dokie.
Hi,
She's in the waiting room.
I was having some technical issues.
She's in the
Thank
waiting
you.
room. Oh, she's in now. There she is.
Excellent. Hey.
Thank you, Madam President.
All
Hello?
right. I have.
You got a frame.
Okay. All right. Let's get. All right. So I have Counselor Campbell. Just confirming you can hear me. We can hear you.
Yes, I can. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. All right. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and start this hearing. Very excited. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm City Councilor Lydia Edwards, Chair of the Committee on Government Operations. It is Tuesday, October 20th, 2020, and we are here today for a virtual hearing on Docket 0945, an ordinance amending Chapter 12-9 of the City of Boston Code Ordinances regarding human rights. Councilor Andrea Campbell and Council President Kim Janey sponsored this proposal, and it was referred to the committee on August 19, 2020. In accordance with Governor Baker's executive order, we're modifying our meeting to allow for this process to happen on Zoom. This helps us balance public health issues, but also allows us to do our jobs. The public may watch this meeting via live stream at www.boston.gov/city-council-tv. And it will be rebroadcasted at a later date on Comcast/8 or Comcast 8/RCN82/Verizon 1964. For public testimony, written comments may be sent to the committee email at ccc.go@boston.gov and will be made part of the record. This proposal amends the City of Boston Code Chapter 12-9 by adding new sections that would prohibit covered employers from discriminating against employees or applicants based upon credit history information and imposes penalties for violations. Docket 0954 contains exemptions for a position or employment classification where credit information is an established bona fide occupational requirement, and the City of Boston's Human Rights Commission would have the authority to enforce the provisions of this proposal. With us today from the administration are Vivian Leonard, Director of Human Resources, City of Boston, Evandro Carvalho, Executive Director of the Boston Human Rights Commission of the City of Boston, Lynn Sanders, Deputy Director of the Mayor's Office of Workforce Development, City of Boston. Also joining us is Nadine Cohen from Greater Boston Legal Services. I'm not sure if Nadine's come on yet, but she will, and I'll just go ahead and introduce her. She's again from Greater Boston Legal Services. So I'm going to turn it over, after I introduce all of my colleagues who are here today, I will turn it over to the lead sponsors for opening remarks, and then we're going to get to business. We've been joined also, I have two blue hands, by Michael Flaherty and Julia Mejia. Okay. So joining us today, we have Councilor Liz Braden, Councilor Ed Flynn, Councilor Kenzie Bach, Councilor Kim Janey, the co-sponsor, Councilor Campbell, co-sponsor, Julia Mejia, and Councilor Flaherty. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the lead sponsors, Councilor Janey and Councilor Campbell, for any opening remarks. We'll go through very briefly. I'm going to move this along because I think this is such an exciting moment, but I don't want us to be kind of caught in the moment. I really want us to get the work done. So to Councilor Janey or Councilor Campbell, whoever you would like to go first. All right.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Madam President. Honored to co-sponsor this ordinance with you. It continues the work actually that I did with now Congresswoman Presley back in 2016. We went back and forth, and this is sort of bringing it back to the forefront, and I think it's a critical time to do so. The ordinance, in simple terms, establishes protections against unlawful credit discrimination in employment practices in the City of Boston. Credit checks have proven to be a barrier to employment for individuals burdened with student loans, medical bills, or those who have been involved with the criminal justice system. This legislation would make it unlawful and a discriminatory practice for an employer to seek, procure, or use credit information regarding an employee or applicant in connection with hiring, discharge, tenure, promotion, discipline, or any other condition of employment. There is no evidence that one's credit history is determinative of one's success as an employee. And that's a critical point, because already we've heard from folks that suggest that this is critical information to determine one's character or success. It's not true. However, what we do know is credit history can be a significant barrier to someone who is looking to obtain a job, especially for those in our Black and Latinx communities who are more likely to report bad credit, which they often attribute to debt from medical bills. Obviously, we are in the midst of COVID-19, and these issues are only going to get worse as people are facing high unemployment rates, or losing their job, I should say, or of course are in fear of being evicted or having other things turn up on their credit score, or anything with respect to medical costs. This is going to prove an even more significant barrier to folks obtaining employment, which we know is critically important, not only for an individual and a resident to be employed. It's important to close the racial wealth gap, it's important for the community, and it's important for the city's economy. And by eliminating barriers to most jobs, this legislation makes access to employment opportunities more equitable in the city of Boston, and would, I think, and I think my Madam President and co-sponsor would agree, be one solution to close the profound racial wealth gap here in the city of Boston. Other cities such as New York, Chicago, Philadelphia have done this. And so I'm looking forward to a robust conversation with the administration. And I appreciate you guys being here, as well as with my council colleagues and advocates. I will tell you, there were some folks we have been engaging on this issue who have been doing some of the work who could not make the hearing today. So we will make sure that we get testimony and information from them, which can also inform this conversation as well. So thank you, Madam President, for your partnership, and thank you, Madam Chair, for scheduling this so quickly, and for your leadership. Thank you.
Councilor Campbell, or Councilor Janey, excuse me. Sorry.
Thank you so much.
I've done that before.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And I want to start by thanking my sister in service, Councilor Campbell, for her partnership on this ordinance to outlaw discriminatory credit-based practices used by employers, but also for her leadership on this issue. Thank you for bringing our former colleague, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, into this space. Certainly want to recognize her leadership as she continues to fight on this very issue. As a counselor, I have really, and as an organizer, I have really centered racial and economic justice issues in all of my work. This is no different. We know that using credit checks can unfairly penalize individuals who are burdened with student loan debt. We had a good hearing about that last night. People with medical bills or otherwise who just have bad credit history, and more often than not, it is poor Black and brown folks who are often disproportionately impacted by these issues. And so credit checks can then be a barrier to employment, which then could, you know, if they don't get the employment that they're seeking, then how are they ever going to pay back any of these loans? One thing that I'd like to just mention, and Councilor Campbell talked about other cities and what other cities are doing. And so there are models to look to. One of the things that we know because of COVID and the impact that it's having on residents and their ability to maintain employment, there's also an uptick in scams. And I'm recently a victim of identity theft, and I know others in our city are experiencing the same thing. And so we really don't want to see people who have had their credit adversely impacted, whether it be student loan debt, medical bills, because of COVID or for other reasons, or who have otherwise being scammed, also have this burden of not being able to get gainful employment. So I think this is a very timely conversation. I'm glad to see so many of my colleagues here. I want to thank the amazing panel that is with us, and looking forward to moving forward on this important work. So thank you again to my colleague and co-sponsor, Councilor Campbell, and thank you, Madam Chair, and to all my colleagues.
Thank you. So in order of arrival, again, I will go to my colleagues for opening remarks, and I will finish after. I'll go last. So Councilor Braden.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the sponsors of this really important ordinance. I look forward to the conversation this afternoon. I think this is a really critical issue, as our colleagues have just outlined. It is an impediment to people to make progress, and it's something that needs to be fixed. So I hope we can make progress and get this done. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Flynn.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Edwards, for chairing this hearing, and to Councillor Campbell and Councillor Janey for sponsoring this and for your leadership on this as well. I believe that we should do what we can to ensure that job seekers are afforded employment opportunities based on their ability, not in something like credit history. Someone can have a bad credit history because they have had medical bills for a child, various emergencies. We had a hearing yesterday on student debt, and we know that having student debt is a prevalent issue, and that impacts someone's credit history also. Things happen, and many people have to take on debt, and they shouldn't be penalized when they are seeking employment. I also filed a hearing order with Councillor Campbell and Councillor Edwards on the Human Rights Commission and utilizing it to prevent and investigate discrimination. I'm glad the Human Rights Commission is playing a part in this hearing today. And I want to recognize Evandro for his leadership. He's someone I have great respect for as well. I look forward to discussing how we can best work with the Human Rights Commission. Thank you for everyone for being here, and I look forward to learning more about this issue. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Bach.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much to the sponsors. I think this is fantastic work, and I just think it's really important to highlight the ways in our society in which we sort of tie everything up together and make it so that it's harder for somebody to simultaneously, right? It's harder to get a job. It's harder to get housing. It's like we have a lot of systems where, as Councillor Campbell said, your credit history is irrelevant to how you're going to perform. And yet we sort of drag people down into these interconnected nets. And I think each of those silos has major problems in the way that, and major racial equity implications in the way that we classify people, but it's even worse that we let these things sort of seep across those silos. So I think anything we can do, I would like to see us reform the whole credit history system, but anything we can do to at least make it not also have these negative implications for people in employment is really important to the work. So grateful for this, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Mejia.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you to the chair, Councillor Edwards, and to the sponsors, Councillor Campbell and Janey, for holding this hearing. I am so incredibly grateful that I am serving on this council alongside you all, because when we're talking about disruption, this is what it looks like. I'm just incredibly super inspired. But before I go too off script, let me go back. Last night we had a hearing on student debt and its impact on students in Boston, particularly students of color. We heard from one student borrower who, because of some problems with his Sallie Mae payment, had his credit score dropped 150 points in one day, okay? Under the current law, that single error could be used against him when he goes to apply for jobs. As the chair of the Committee on Small Business and Workforce Development, I fully support this initiative and look forward to offering my thoughts on this matter. And I'm just again going back to how grateful I am to in partnership with conversations that are really going to help disrupt the way we do business and how we're going to really create a pathway out of poverty for so many folks here. So really happy to be joining Councillor Janey and Campbell on this effort. So thank you so much for hosting this.
Thank you. Councillor Flaherty.
Thank you, Chairwoman Edwards. Good afternoon, everybody. for participating and for the lead sponsors. As we all know, last year we held a hearing on a proposed ordinance relative to the establishment of an independent commission on equal opportunity and the elimination of systemic bias in the workplace that was sponsored by you, Madam Chair, along with Councilor Campbell and then our former Councilor Josh Zakem. And during that hearing, we talked about the role of the Human Rights Commission and how the mayor had reactivated the HRC, which, as some of us remember, was created. I know Vivian can attest to this, and obviously Councilor Flynn, because I think his dad was mayor at the time, created the ordinance back in 1984. And it's good to see Director Cavallo, who was also at that meeting and testified on behalf of the role of the commission in the expected timeline to bring the HRC back to full operating speed. And so Godspeed to Director Cavallo and best of luck. And we'll look forward to continue working with both you and Vivian in this space. And the council at the time voiced support for HRC's work and emphasized how we as a body should ensure that the HRC maintains its independence and to be fully funded to achieve all of its goals and objectives. So I look forward to this discussion today, particularly as it pertains to the unlawful credit discrimination that is taking place, and more specifically, what role the HRC can do to prevent this from happening in our city, and using our buying ability, using our banking relationships should obviously play a key role front and center on this. But would love to hear from folks that see it on a day-to-day basis, be it Cavallo or Vivian and or any other representative from the administration. So look forward to listening and participating. And again, thank you to the chair and thank you to the lead sponsors.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be part of this conversation as we make history as a council that is historic in its own right. And just wanted to note, so much of what people are suffering with ends up on their credit record, whether you were able to pay the medical bills, whether you were able to pay your student loans, whether you were able to pay for costs with dealing with an emergency, if your house burns down. There's so many different things about life and moments of pain and injury that if you are not able to rebound or to overcome them immediately, become part of your credit record, which if you look at them in many cases, is just an example of how someone has suffered and tried to get back on their feet for years at a time. That also ignores the fact that people are victimized, and there are predatory lenders out there that come out of their way to target poor people, people of color in communities, and ruin their lives by making them put them on a hamster wheel of debt that they will never be able to get off of. And if they do, they lose everything. So this is a moment where the city of Boston is saying those moments and those decisions, and if you even had an opportunity to make those decisions, will not define your ability to have a job, to be employed. It will not define you either as your character, nor should it. And the more we take that out of that consideration for these life-altering opportunities, the more we are saying your credit score doesn't define who you are as a human being. And I'm very happy about that. I look forward to the conversation today because I would love to talk about how the jurisdiction for employers with 6 or less folks, when we want to be consistent with some of the laws we pass for domestic workers, it goes down to fewer than 6. I'm curious, honestly, if there's any way to apply this discrimination protected class to our housing market so that credit scores aren't used to prevent you from becoming a tenant. I'm curious if there's ways in which we can include or add eviction as part of this so that your prior evictions also won't be a reason as to why people can't employ you. Those are just questions that I have to make sure that this is, when we say credit score shouldn't define you, we mean in all aspects of your life in Boston. And except for the exceptions that the co-sponsors had already laid out, where it is a bona fide qualification for your job or your housing, but I don't know where it would be. Just want to remind folks, in a rent-burdened city where people are struggling, oftentimes the reason why their credit score is off is because they're paying their rent and the other bills don't get paid. So again, I'm excited about this conversation. I want to thank the lead sponsors for your leadership. So with that being said, Councilor Campbell or Councilor Janey, do you have a particular order of folks you'd like to speak on this, or do you mind if I just go ahead and through Okay.
You can go ahead and start with folks in your order. It's fine. And thank you to everyone from the administration for being here,
Thank you.
for the
So,
work you do every day. Thank you.
so why don't we go ahead and start with Vivian, and then Evandro, and then Lynn. And I don't think that Nadine is here yet. But that's, if that order works for you guys,
That's fine.
or however you guys want to do. If you had a different order, I apologize. I just, you know,
No, your suggestion's fine.
okay, okay.
Good afternoon, counselors. Thank you for inviting my colleagues and I to participate in today's hearing regarding the issue of credit checks. As you are aware, the City of Boston has taken our hiring policies and practices very serious in order to ensure that we are not having barriers to employment. We continue to refine the process and to partner with such partners as the Mayor's Office of Workforce Development to create and open doors of opportunity. So I'm happy to say that we don't do credit checks. We do queries. So the Office of Human Resources performs queries where applicable for all city departments, with the exception of the Police Department and the Boston Public Schools. In accordance with Massachusetts law, query checks are performed for positions where employees will have unsupervised contact with youth 18 or younger, elders, disabled, jobs requiring employees to be bonded, or jobs which require special police license. So we have been of the opinion, and continuing to look at our process and refine our process, that if there are issues with respect to someone not being able to perform a particular aspect of their job as it relates to a query, then, we will look at it at that point in time. But just so you have a little bit more background, as a part of the application process, we do not ask people for a query history as a part of an application process. What we do is we post on the job posting so that individuals or applicants would know that in applying for this job, if you are made an offer or you are considered the best candidate at the end of the process, then we will seek your authorization in order to perform a query. And it's only at that point in time that we would perform a query. So for individuals that work in, say, a financial position, whether it be our Treasury Department, our auditing department, our budget office, those individuals are bonded. So in addition to being bonded, we're performing queries on them, but we do not perform credit checks. So that's just to, lay some groundwork, but we're definitely very interested in listening and being a part of this conversation. Thank you.
It just says taxi.
Director Cavallo?
Listed area. But you're telling
1
me
second.
they don't clean the.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. 1 second, please.
Okay. Triangle.
If I can figure it out. Working from home, technical difficulty issues, but essentially, obviously, I want to say thank you I'm Evandro Cavallo, for those who do not know. I have the privilege of being the executive director of the Boston Human Rights Commission. First of all, I want to thank the counselors, the lead sponsors, for inviting me to come here to speak about, this important issue. I want to thank all the counselors that are present, and particularly those that have continually showed support and interest in the Human Rights Commission. I've obviously had the privilege, I read the ordinance, and I'm here to also listen, right? I read and saw that the ordinance empowers the Human Rights Commission to implement, essentially the changes, right? Once if this becomes law in the city of Boston. So, obviously, in general, I guess the Human Rights Commission have met I guess I'll take a quick history of the commission. Not a big history, but just to say that obviously I started a year ago and been here since August and trying to get the Human Rights Commission off the ground. In January, we finally had the commissioners appointed. We have 7 excellent people on the commission. We obviously earlier this year, COVID hit and things became even more hectic for all of us. And the commission has been meeting online like you have. We've met several times, I believe at least 4, and we have our next meeting coming up on the 30th, I believe, next week. And we're looking for ways. The commissioners keep talking about ways that we can impact equity and inclusion in the city of Boston. That's the struggle that we all in this public space trying to do. So I'm here with essentially on behalf of the commission, listen to see how we can help this initiative, and hopefully report back to the commission and get a sense of what we can do to help. Actually, the meeting is October 28th, which I believe is next Wednesday. So that's my opening statement, if you will. I'm in open arms, and I want to engage and learn more about this issue, and hopefully, be a benefit to this initiative.
Thank you. And Lynn Sanders.
Hi, I am Lynn Sanders, Deputy Director for the Mayor's Office of Workforce Development. As others have said, I'd like to thank the City Council for inviting me to talk about this important issue today and to learn more about the ordinance that's being proposed. The Mayor's Office of Workforce Development is the city agency that seeks to promote economic self-sufficiency and ensure the full participation of Boston residents in the city's economic vitality and future, and connect low-income residents with job training, employment opportunities, and promote lifelong educational pathways. And as a part of this work, our office has been involved by under Mayor Walsh in 2017, launching the Boston Builds Credit Initiative, in recognition of many of the issues posed by credit histories that have already been discussed, as an effort to support residents who do not have good credit scores to improve those credit scores, in partnership with United Way, LISC Boston, and there are 25 community and employer partners that aren't in part of that initiative. And as well as just in 2020, the Office of Workforce Development launched Project Opportunity to speak to other barriers. Project Opportunity is faced on individuals who have Corey records, and that becomes a barrier for their employment. So that is launched in partnership with the Office of Public Safety, Office of Returning Citizens, and SOAR Boston, and is providing Corey sealing and expungement counseling, as well as virtual panels, Corey training, and information sessions. So far, that has helped over 190 residents impacted by Corey, and 400 participants have been in the virtual events. And we'll be hosting a virtual job fair for residents impacted by Corey coming up in a week on October 27th. And I am happy to speak more about those initiatives of office or anything else that city councilors would be relevant to the ordinance today. Thanks.
Thank you. So I just make it clear for my colleagues, is it, and then I don't know if you're prepared to say it today, the administration is supportive of this, maybe not word for word, but I want to make sure I'm clear. Are we still convincing you that that it should be removed as a point for employment? If you're anybody from the administration is.
I can pitch in briefly, Councilor. From my end, right, from the executive director's point of view of Boston Human Rights Commission, it's more or less what we haven't done, right? Obviously, I got an invitation for this meeting I believe late last week, and I'm here now. But the decision more so, I think it's more, I'm leaning more on what the commissioners want to do, right? More so than, if you will, directly from the administration. So I can't speak. I'm not sure if you understand the difference, right? Because and I'm actually trying to figure that out too myself. But the government body of the Boston Human Rights Commission is the 7 commissioners, right? To an extent. So when I bring that back to them, then we'll discuss and then have a point of view from that point, right? I'm not, as DED in a sense, I don't feel that I have the will or the power to come in and say, yeah, we support this and we don't support this, right? Obviously we're a department of the city and we're invited to this meeting that pertains to the ordinance that obviously changes parts of the Human Rights Commission, which makes it relevant for me to be here. But I'm not sure at this point I'm in a position to say either or in terms of where the administration stands. But I'm unable to commit the commission in the sense that I need to speak, report back. This is, to me, more or less if I gather the information, listen and then report back to the commission and then have a discussion, because that's the infrastructure currently that the commission functions, right, if you will. Does that make sense?
Yes. So from Vivian or from Lynn?
So, Councillor Edwards, thank you for the question. I can say that the city of Boston and the administration, I think, has been at the forefront of this issue, which is why we currently do not do credit checks. We made that decision. I think there was a hearing sponsored by Councillor Campbell in 2016. And at that point, prior to that hearing, we had made the decision, and that continues to be the case. We feel like we have a process currently in place that does not involve credit checks, that is meeting our needs. And as I stated earlier, we continue to work with various partners, including the Mayor's Office of Workforce Development, in terms of looking at ensuring how we're opening doors and creating opportunities. So with respect to the Corey panels that they've been sponsoring, I've been participating in that, and just making sure that we are opening those doors for individuals in our community, especially people of color, and allowing them to take advantage of what is offered by the city of Boston. And as a resident and a native of Boston, I take great pride in that.
Wonderful. So I don't hear a yes, we support this quite yet, but I hear we're willing to work on something together and acknowledge, and I do want to acknowledge the city's leadership in already eliminating this, except when as a bona fide process or part of the job qualification. So why don't we then, and I just want to be clear to my colleagues and to folks who are watching, the reason why I asked this is, while it's great the city of Boston is taking the leadership, these will apply, and I want to be clear, to employers in Boston. An employer means any individual, partnership, association, corporation, trustees, public charity, foundation, political subdivision, board, department, commission, agency, or any other person which engages and controls the services of an individual in the city of Boston in exchange for monetary or other valuable consideration. It goes beyond the city. It goes to anybody with at least 6 people in their employment in the city of Boston. So the question is, while the city is willing to hold itself to that standard, are we as council, or is the city comfortable with holding all the other employees with 6 or more employees to the standard? That is the question that, I'm putting out there. And so I just wanted to make sure that's clear. We don't have an absolute yes for that particular question, but so that's what I wanted to make sure I was clear. So we can go through the line of folks from my colleagues, starting again with order of arrival, for any questions that they have for the administration or for the lead sponsors. You should each have a copy of this ordinance proposed ordinance in front of you to question about, definitions of financial institution, credit information. What does that all mean? That should be also, and any suggestions you also have for language. So going in order of arrival, Councillor Liz Braden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think this is for the sponsors. You mentioned that other cities have done this. Do we have any data on how successful that has been in changing economic opportunities for residents in those jurisdictions?
I'll say no, that's something actually we're working on. So thank you, Councilor Braden, for the question. And so can circle back on that particular piece outside of just sort of anecdotal work. There's more work to do to determine whether or not this is effective. I do think we've heard, and we're waiting for some of the GBLS folks to get on right now with respect to this issue, that it is effective, and I wanted them to speak to that. So hopefully she can join us in panel 2.
Yeah, I think,
Let me just add to that, Councilor Braden.
Go ahead.
So I think my team as well, we are still gathering data and information, and I do think GBLS will provide more of that when they're able to join. But one thing that my team was able to find, and this is from the Harvard Kennedy School, so right here, and they were using data from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York Consumer Credit Panel. And they found that banning credit checks raised employment and low credit census tracts by roughly 1.9 to 3.3% compared to those without bans. So there is some data to support this. This was, again, a small piece, but we need to continue to gather data. And I hopefully Nadine will be able to join us.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this initiative because as we've already talked about, healthcare indebtedness and student loans are a huge burden for people, and that burden should not become an impediment to gainful employment. So really applaud this initiative and look forward to learning more. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Flynn.
Thank you, Councilor Edwards. I had a similar question as Councilor Braden did, maybe for Councilor Campbell or Councilor Janey. I think Councilor Braden may have referenced it, but were you researching other major cities across the country to see if they have this in their ordinance, in their bylaws, and if they do, what are some of the pros and cons that maybe we have that we could learn?
Your computer needs to be plugged in.
So the short answer is yes.
Come over here.
And I don't know that there's we might have
Over
to
here and sit down.
hello.
Go
Sorry,
ahead.
I have to mute some folks. So I don't see necessarily any cons. What we were seeing is that people were doing an assessment of what are the barriers to people obtaining jobs. And sometimes it was in the context of closing racial wealth gaps, creating greater wealth in communities. So that study that President Janey referenced, which isn't necessarily specifically done by, say, Philadelphia. We have this ordinance and here's our study. It was looking at the array of barriers that keep people from getting employment. So whether it was a consumer report, a credit report, Corey, but sometimes Corey reports include credit information too. So that was going to be some of my questions for the administration, is how often they're hearing about this when they're looking at Corey's in particular, how much of it connects to not just criminal history, but also credit history. So it was more pros than cons. It was how do we remove barriers with respect to this? And I do want, I'm hoping, frankly, that Nadine can join us. I'm not sure where she is. We're trying to find her to speak to this, because when we held this hearing back in 2016, GBLS was with us, and there was a lot of concern from them as to, with respect to their constituent cases and conversations even before we filed the ordinance on how this was absolutely a barrier to people obtaining jobs. And there was some national data. Senator Warren actually had just released or filed legislation at the federal level. And so then it was a conversation with then Councilor Presley on how do we do something locally after we had just left a conversation with Senator Warren based on her work at the federal level to eliminate this particular piece in terms of people obtaining employment, and really sort of diving into a more robust conversation on what are the barriers that people tend to use that connect to a system, not necessarily evidence-based, that exclude people. And this was one of them. No one could point to a report or study that absolutely connected your financial credit report with you being effective as an employee. So then the question was, why are we continuing to have this be a barrier? And in 2016, it came out of the conversation based on national data. So a lot of my questions are for the administration have to do with what they're seeing or hearing from folks who come to us as to this particular issue. Sorry, that was a long response, Councilor Flynn.
No, thank you, Councilor Campbell. The answer was excellent. It was very helpful. Thank you for your response. Councilor Edwards, I have no further questions. Thank you.
Kenzie, Councilor Bach asked us to push back her questions. So I'm going to go ahead and go through the order and then come back to Councilor Bach. Councilor Janey, did you have any questions or comments? You're on mute, Councilor Janey.
Thank you so much. There's a lot of noise back here. So one thing I want to point out, and I want to start by again thanking the panel. Thank you for your intros, and more important, thank you for the work that you're doing on behalf of Boston residents and City and Boston employees, you know, every single day, not just for being here in this hearing. And one thing I'm hearing is that in practice, there are some good things happening. And while it's good when good things are happening in practice and when there are some good people in place to make sure that that happens, but you know, our job as a legislative body is to ensure that that practice is codified with policy and legislation. And just as we had to pass an ordinance to ban facial recognition in the city of Boston, a tool that our Boston Police Department was not using at the time, but we felt it important enough because that technology exists and it is prevalent in other places, and we knew the harm that it would do here in Boston. So it was incumbent upon us as a legislative body to ban that, even though we weren't doing that in practice. And I use that example because even though I hear you saying, Ms. Leonard, that we're not using credit checks, at least in the city of Boston, I think I heard you say that in your opening, and that's great. Like, I applaud that, but I think we want to go a step further. And for me, it's what we do here as a city and how we lead here with our employees. But for me, this goes beyond that. We've got to make sure that employers all throughout our city are doing the right thing. And so I guess, one, I wanted to make that point, but two, you know, I think it is important that we have some sort of indication of how we might move forward. Like if there's an opening of, we think we're doing good work now and we're open to having conversations about this legislation and how we might move forward, what I really need to know then is if there's a specific issue with some of the language, if so, what that is, how can we tackle it? If there's something missing, you know, what is it? Let's put it in there. If there's something that is worrisome, I want to make sure that we're getting at that conversation. For me, we are beyond the conversation as to whether we need it. We are still gathering evidence and we can make that case, or folks who need us to make that case. But I think it is very clear for people, at least in the Zoom call, that credit checks and that disproportionately impacts poor people, particularly Black and Latinx folks who are overly burdened with medical debt, student debt, are less likely to be able to get home loans, less likely able to get out of that cycle of bad consumer debt, much more likely to be renting furniture and doing their banking in cash, check cashing places, et cetera. And so that evidence is clear. I don't want to continue to debate whether or not credit checks will hurt in a potential employee's opportunity for employment. I think that's clear. I want to get down to the nitty gritty around this language, this ordinance, what the administration likes and thinks is great, what the administration thinks is more problematic and might need some tweaking. So that's the conversation that I hope to have with this, and hope that someone on the panel representing the administration could respond to that.
Anyone from the administration want to respond to Councilor Janey?
So I don't, when I look at this, and I can speak from the city of Boston, if you would respect to what
I'm
we're
sorry, I
doing.
cannot hear you. There's just a lot. Thank you. I couldn't hear you. Could you start over? There was
Sure.
lots of background noise going on.
Absolutely. So with respect to looking at this as an employer, I would say that there's definitely some valid points. I don't think, we are at odds on that at all. I just think that it's looking at this as a whole, especially when you're talking about other employers. We just want to make sure that we're on the same page, we're proceeding appropriately. And, we'll definitely have to review the overall at the end of this whole discussion and take in all of the recommendations and look at what we have here for recommendations, written documents, and how to proceed, what the next steps are, and, review it with the mayor, with legal counsel. So, I think that's why we're here, to definitely have a conversation, hear all of the recommendations, and then decide where to go from there.
Councilor Janey,
Am I out of time? I don't know. I would have
if you wanted to do one quick other
Yeah.
comment, then okay.
I wonder, with the relationships that we have, and this might be for Ms. Sanders, the relationships we have with employers, I don't know, it might be with you, Ms. Leonard, with employers in our city. I know that there are some networks that happen, and we try to encourage these employers to either hire young people, BPS students. We have all of these different relationships. So I guess, what's the next step? And if the administration is looking, and I'm not sure if this is what you're saying, so please correct me if it's not what you're saying, but if you're looking for more engagement, more buy-in with other employers, how might the city do that? Is that what you were suggesting?
So I think we have to take into consideration where other employers are and what they're doing. I don't, profess to speak for all other employers outside of the city of Boston, right? So that.
But
right.
Do we have a sense of how many of the employers in our network that we work with through summer jobs or however we're working with them are using credit checks through their employment process? For example, that's one question. Of all of those, what percentage or how many are not doing it? How many are doing it but may be open to a change? Like, I guess I'm just trying to understand how we move it forward.
So I can tell you that the employers that hire the summer youth and work with us in partnership, they're not performing credit checks because we are doing the query checks here at the city of Boston for all of those youth that do get hired.
Yeah, I guess what I would, and then I'm going to yield my time. I'm sure there are other questions, Madam Chair. They may not be doing it for the young people that we are in partnership and asking them to hire, but they may do it as part of their practice for all their other employers and employees. So I guess, my question is, and we may not have that information here, and that's fine. We'll have to seek it out. But a question is, that I do have and wonder, is for those employers that we have official relationship with as a city, how many of them use credit checks as part of their onboarding process or hiring process? And maybe we don't have that, and maybe we have to figure out a way to get that information. I'm going to yield my time for now in case there are other questions, and if there's time, certainly I can come back if I have additional questions, Madam Chair. But thank you, Ms. Leonard. And unless Ms. Sanders wanted to throw something in there to the mix, I would yield my time.
Just to answer your question, Counselor, that's a very good question, and we don't have that information, but we can most definitely look to see if we can get that information.
Yes, same thing I was going to say is, I don't think from the Office of Workforce Development Networks, I can speak to what the prevalence of the credit checking is, but that's something we should look into.
Thank you. And perhaps it's something that we can get answered when Nadine joins us as well. But thank you, Madam Chair. I'll yield my time.
For those of you, Nadine and I have been texting. She just is looking for the Zoom link. So for someone who has access to
I'll
send her
have Ellie send her the Zoom link.
to her GBLS account.
Perfect. Thank you, Lydia.
You're welcome. Counselor Campbell.
So one of my questions is, obviously we started this conversation back in 2016, and Vivian, I do appreciate your leadership with respect to, where we have control right now, directly, of course, the city of Boston. And so I guess I have two questions related to, one is, are we hearing from, as clients or residents are coming to us, whether it's through Office of Workforce Development for programs or talking about concerns related to the Corey, how often are you hearing, do we have any information whatsoever? We track our constituent cases in our office, so we can say there's a decent amount of people concerned about credit hindering their ability to get a job. So I'm curious from your department's perspective, and maybe this is more a question for Lynn as well, given the programs you guys do, or Evandro, based on the work you're doing with the commission, what you're hearing from community with respect to this concern being a problem. And then the second is, how does Corey relate to this? Because when I was doing research, whether it's a credit report, consumer report, Corey, we often use these words. They're sometimes interchangeable, they're not, but all of them can contain information related to one's financial history. And that be the problem that, for example, prohibits them from getting a job, but it's wrapped up in something else. So I'm curious if we're seeing any of that from the city's perspective with respect to the type of reports and where where financial information can live.
So Counselor Campbell, thank you for that question. That's a very good question. From the perspective of quarries, unless there is some type of crime that is affiliated with credit, we're not seeing that on the quarries. So if someone has outstanding debt, student loans, that does not appear on the quarry. And to be quite frank, I can't recall in the recent past seeing anything that was pertaining to finance or credit on a Corey report.
Counselor Campbell.
I got muted really quickly. And I do know there are some federal restrictions, right, on what can exist where and all of that. But that's a question that comes up. And I'm curious from your perspective, Lynn and Evandro, what you're hearing from constituents, from advocacy organizations. We obviously are hearing that people have debts, that they're really concerned, but this specifically showing up in the employment context based on where you guys sit.
Sure, thanks, Counselor Campbell. I don't think I can, I actually don't think I can really speak specifically to credit as a barrier that has come up a lot in the context of employment conversations. I feel like Corey, it's definitely one that generally has been more prevalent for me in terms of what is causing a barrier for people. And often the credit conversations are more related to general financial well-being and being able to get loans and buy homes and all that. But I could follow up more with our partners in Boston Builds Credit and see, bring back some more information about what evidence of the folks that have been coming to improve their credit, how many of them it is because employment is a concern for them.
Oof. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes,
I just want to make sure.
I understand, Evandro.
I'm good timing. I'm sorry.
I think we all do. So go ahead.
It just threw me off a little bit. Okay. All right. So, I just want to say this, right? I think, one, I don't want to leave you with the impression that the Human Rights Commission is not interested in the issue. In fact, this ending desperate treatment sort of things like this, systematic approach to issues is what we're looking at right now, and it fits our mission. But honestly, I can tell you and for me, one that the department is new. So, I wouldn't base on what we're hearing and not hearing on us, particularly since,
Right.
COVID hit, we're not branded, we're not out there yet. So I
Yeah,
wouldn't go
right.
off of that. But I do say, and this is just me speaking myself as director, and based on what the commissioners want to do, I do see an opportunity potentially here for some basic gathering of information, right? I think it'd be helpful. I mean, it sounds like at least it would be helpful if we could get information from major employment employers in the city, or small employers, maybe 50 or 100, and say, tell us what your policy is on this, right? And if they are asking people for, however they're getting that information, if they are looking at the credit history of individuals and making decisions, or whatever decisions they are, based on that, then to me, then we have a real problem, right? That we should tackle head on. That I would believe the commission would be interested in, right? But I do think that there is. I don't get like I feel like we need to know more based on this, at least from what I'm hearing. That we need to sort of, if we're going to be impactful with a policy like this, right? And again, take it with a grain of salt. This is just me speaking, and I'm not speaking technically on behalf of the administration, and to some extent, even on behalf of the commission. But I am the executive director, and I have been present on these meetings and know what we're looking for. I do think this could fit the bill, but at minimum, I think we want to know the data, if you will, right? Not that, again, it's something that we all as policymakers want to talk about, but it'd be helpful to say, okay, in Dorchester, this is happening to communities of color. And we know there's so many other issues that are impacting all of us now, but it'd be more helpful for me, at least, if I know, if whether it's through the city or through the city council, any other department can get we can get some sort of baseline, right? We know this issue is out there, but how much is it that we can do to impact it, right? Is what I'm trying to get.
No, and I appreciate you being very candid there, Evandro, with respect to this. But I think it goes back to President Janey's point,
right,
which is we want to be as proactive as possible, right? If we've heard this from enough folks, which we have, including advocacy organizations that participated in the hearing in 2016, who talked about this being a barrier. Some folks may not even know it's a barrier or could be a barrier. Folks also talked about the inaccuracies in these reports, and even with the lack of tracking data, it's still a problem and a barrier to folks obtaining employment, even though there's no evidence, right, that it is useful to determining people's success. So we, of course, want to be proactive in eliminating that barrier, but it's also, of course, helpful too to have more information on how it may show up in the employment context. We do know it shows up. So it was more of a question around, what are you guys hearing from where you sit, given your connection to the advocacy organizations who are talking about just debt generally for communities of color, but also the program we do, our residents actually speaking to you guys about some of these concerns. So I just appreciate that. I do know, I was just looking back at some of my previous notes from the 2016 hearing of folks talking about, not only is it used, sometimes people are using this now in lieu of a query to prohibit folks from getting employment. GBLS spoke to that candidly in our 2016 hearing. They also talked about how parents are also affected, right? They're taking out loans or assisting their children, and how that can prohibit them. So I'll defer my time, Councilor Edwards. I can always come back to the next round. I want to be respectful to my colleagues, but I thank you guys for those responses.
Thank you. Councilor Mejia, and Flaherty, and then Bach.
Thank you for this informative conversation. I think it's so interesting that this conversation started in 2016, and it just seems like we keep having the same conversation, and it's just get dressed up in a different era and a decade, and the only thing that's changing is our hairstyles, if anything. But our people are staying in the same space, and I am so over all of that. So I'm so incredibly grateful that we have this opportunity here today to really push a little bit further. Having grown up in the city of Boston as well, for me, this is something that I think if we're really serious about moving the needle, now is the time to do so. And without any hiccups, let's just keep it moving. I'm just really curious about this. If a person is denied a job because of their credit score, which is in violation of the law, there's not much we can do to make that company hire them. How can we use this ordinance in a way that trains employees to know their rights? I'm also curious about the fine listed in the ordinance is 100 every time an employer violates this law. How did how did we come up with this number? And I'm just curious about the big companies in the city of Boston who can discriminate against folks who just take that $100 loss. Maybe we need to make it a little bit more aggressive. Maybe $1,000 as opposed to 100. You know, we want to hit them where their pockets hurt. And then you all know I'm the queen of dashboards because every single hearing I'm always talking about, is there a dashboard? But I'm just curious if there's a way that we can keep a public log of companies that have been fined as a result of this law, just so that we can keep this visibility and hopefully that prospect employees know to stay clear of some of these folks. And then I'm also, the last thing is that I'm curious about what the current human capacity is within the Human Rights Commission, and how would this law impact that? And how will we need to support you to make this happen? And again, Evandro, I really do appreciate the fact that you can't, you're speaking as the executive director, but I'm going to be honest, like Mayor Walsh appointed you into this position, right? And you have leadership, right? And honestly, what's the sense of having people in positions of power if those who are in positions of power can exude that power and speak on what it is that they want to support and want to see, right? So I really do appreciate, the administration and the folks who are here who have some reservations about saying this is something that they can support. But I do know that Mayor Walsh hired you all and appointed you because he trusts you and your leadership. And I hope that you all step into your power and seize these moments and these opportunities to dive in and to embrace what it is that we're trying to do and figure out how we can do it together. So I did ask a lot of questions there, but I will just let you all unpack it. I'm not sure how you want to facilitate, Councilor Edwards, because I did say a lot. So direct the traffic.
Well, why don't we leave the two questions about about fines and punishment, because I believe it's under the jurisdiction of the HRC, to Councilor or to Director Carvalho, and then let's leave the question about the dashboard actually also to I think we can leave it to Lynn and to Vivian, specifically about how we're collecting data on bad actors, I assume it is. So let's start with that.
I'm sorry, Councilor, I missed which point I was supposed to tackle. I'm sorry.
It's okay. So right now in the current language, the Boston Human Rights Commission retains the right to issue a complaint and to follow investigative procedures. There's
Right.
also
Fine.
a fine of $100 that would be, I guess, also part of the Human Rights Commission's jurisdiction. The question was, why is it $100? Could it be more?
I mean, certainly, obviously, to some extent, that's not in our purview, right? If this is done, right? Obviously, this is hopefully one of many conversations on this, but the fine could be $100, and if the fine says $100, that's what we'll have to do, right? But it could go, as Councilor Mejia alluded to, it could be 1,000, it could be 500, it could be 250. But I think that language to some extent.
So we're actually restricted. So the
We
max
are, okay.
is $300. So anytime we want to actually do a higher penalty, we saw this in maybe it was a lobbying ordinance, some other ordinances. You have to go through the state for authority to go higher. But the whole point was to say to employers, our goal is we don't want to penalize people out the gate. We want to shift behavior, right? We want to encourage and incentivize employers to not use this information. And if they refuse to, obviously we have this to go to, but the goal is not to penalize them outside the gate. It really is to have a dialogue and conversation about how this continues to be a barrier for so many people in communities of color. So that's why we started there, which was similar to some other types of ordinances when we're trying to shift behavior.
No, it makes sense. I guess to some extent that the position that she put me into is to kind of make the law, right? Which is why we're not here. I'm not here to do it, in a sense, right? If the ordinance said $100, then that would be the case, right? But the Human Rights Commission, by design, as you alluded to, Councilor Campbell, is sort of focused on mediation, trying to resolve issues instead of going the fine way or the hard way, right, if you will. So that again, this would fit right into the mission of the commission. And to speak a little more about another point that Councilor Mejia had in terms of the capacity of the commission. Right now we're a team of two. In fact, the executive assistant is Susan Helmy. She's again one individual that's in the attendees list. She's here to help me take notes. But we are planning over this fiscal year to hire 7 individuals, including investigator outreach and community engagement, constituent services, as well as education coordinator. And these, again, this is based on the funding that we got, over $500,000 in the budget, and to try to execute it under this fiscal year. And obviously, through COVID and all of that, so we're hopefully going to build the capacity to do the type of work that this initiative is geared to do.
And just for the point about the dashboard or collection of data. So Lynn,
sorry. It obviously, one of the roles of the commission, right, is to study discrimination and to gather reports. So if this became law, the commission could try to collect at least the complaints that we get, that sort of thing, right? So we could track data that we get, right, out of the ordinance, if you will. But I'm not sure if that's what you were trying to get to.
That question for me.
Does that make sense?
Kind of. I mean, I'm thinking about when we think about collecting data and sharing it, it's really more about it's just a public log, right? That people can go in and be able to screen and filter and sort through who are the main folks who aren't like the best teammates, the team players, right? The ones who are violating this most.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so that's kind of where I was looking at.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I would have to get back to you on that. I'm not sure. I'm not 100% sure how we would do that in a sense.
Just to note, and we've been joined by Nadine Cohn from Greater Boston Legal Services. Nadine, we're specifically talking about the language as it's proposed and asking questions to the administration and to the lead sponsors. I don't know if you've gone through the docket itself and had some suggestions for the language or the, to expand, to contract. I know I have more questions. I'm so glad you're here because I have questions about how it can or cannot be expanded. So just to let folks know, Nadine is a massive resource. She's been working on this, was supportive of this. Oh no, don't, no, Nadine, you are. She worked also before Yvonne and other folks. She was at Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. This is, racial justice and eliminating barriers to opportunity, not just in the affirmatively furthering for a housing world, but in life. Nadine has been part of a lot of those conversations. So how we can construct the best bill and how we can make sure this advances those goals. I just wanted to let everyone know Nadine is a huge resource. So what we'll do, Nadine, is I'm going to go ahead and finish the list of folks that includes, I think, Flaherty, myself, and Bach, and then we'll turn it kind of over to you, if that's okay with the lead sponsors, to let Nadine kind of give a purview of her thoughts about credit and it being a barrier to employment. That's okay, lead sponsors, before we go into our second round.
Absolutely. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Nadine.
Councillor Flaherty, he may have stepped off. Councillor Bach.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for rearranging the order. I guess the main question I wanted to ask of the sponsors, and I'm happy to leave further conversation of it to another time, because I think you suggested this might be in your opening comments, but whether the sponsors are open to kind of looping the housing piece in here, or if you want to be keeping these as two separate things. I'm just thinking about how much we heard at our fair housing hearing last week about how the credit score it has a disparate impact on lots of these categories. It's totally keeping people out of housing. It's an enormous issue for BHA voucher holders in terms of accessing apartment stock. And I just think that it's so in the same vein that there's a large part of me that sort of thinks like, oh, it would make sense to have this be a joint thing and kind of work. Obviously, you need some new additional language, but I wanted to hear from you as the sponsors kind of how you are thinking and feeling about that.
I think Jane and I are both like, well, I will say, obviously we filed this before we were entering this crisis. And I was just texting back and forth with Lydia recently, as we were fielding hundreds of calls from fearful tenants and homeowners with respect to being displaced or evicted during this time. I'm absolutely open to it. I think it's a great idea. It connects to the issue, of course. And when you pull apart, when we talk about a credit report, consumer report, all of this information of how people get debt, which is what the hearing was last night with Counselor Janey and Counselor Mejia. So yes, absolutely open to continuing that conversation. And I'll let my co-sponsor weigh in as well.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. Clearly huge need. The thing that I would want to be mindful of is where we are in our legislative calendar, whether or not we can get this through, and do we come back and be more thoughtful and intentional about what we do on that front. I want to do the thing that would make sure that we are getting some work done in this legislative cycle with this particular docket, but I am open because ultimately the issue, whether we are going to revise this particular docket to include it here, or whether we need to have a whole nother piece of legislation, I am with and 100% supportive of that and want to continue to work with you and the rest of my colleagues on how we respond to that need. So I'm open to whether it's here or whether it's elsewhere, but I just want to make sure that we are moving forward in the most intentional, thoughtful, strategic way possible. So that's it for me.
Great. No, that all makes a lot of sense. And I think the one other thing that I want to flag, and I just want to say I'm very happy to work with everybody on that and be guided by you guys as sponsors and by the chair in terms of like what makes sense from a legislative calendar perspective. I also want to flag that I do think as we're having this conversation, we should be looking at any capacity in which the city uses credit scores. Because we obviously heard this good testimony about the fact that we're not using it for employment. And I really appreciate that from the administration. But I know, for instance, that we do collect it from applicants for IDP units. And that's actually something that that New York recently moved away from doing. And basically allowed people to provide their rent history instead in lieu of their credit history. So it shows that you're paying your rent, but it doesn't bring your credit card debt kind of into the conversation. And I just think that when we're, especially like if we're going to pass legislation that sort of puts it on the record for our Human Rights Commission that we think there's a lot of disparate impacts to the way that credit history gets used, we should do a sort of thorough scan across all city-backed programs and policies to like see where we're using credit history and whether those instances are sort of up to snuff and defensible or something that we should be changing. So I just wanted to flag that as another dimension of this as well. Thank you, Madam Chair. Those are all my comments.
Thank you so much. And I think, so just for folks, I'm mindful of all folks, I'm mindful of the legislative calendar, and I have every intention of making sure, again, this historical council makes history this year with this particular ordinance especially. So what will happen is there will be a working session, and now that we have ideally the kind of world in which we're going to be working in, we're going to get to business there and make some very, good decisions. As written, I think this is very good legislation. The question really before us is, what do we think we need to add or what's missing? With that being said, I mentioned it in the opening, Kenzie brought it up, and I'm, bringing it up again. This is credit scores and using that to judge a person's worthiness of housing, of employment, or of other things, right, is questionable act. It's a questionable how useful that really is. Now, again, there are carve-outs specifically already in this legislation that I think we're balancing that need. And I couldn't be more excited about Kenzie's suggestion that the city, as it's already taking leadership, as Vivian has noted, the city's already taking leadership in this particular matter, take additional leadership and examine where it's using credit scores, right? Beyond the bona fide exceptions for employment. If we're using it in housing, if we're using it in any other area, take the leadership and go ahead and remove that if it has nothing to do with those things. IDP especially, trying to get into an affordable unit and then using your credit score to say you can't get in there. Come on, that doesn't make any sense. The other area I'd love the city to look at and start to gather data is to follow up on Councilor Janey's point. You know, the power of the purse is the most powerful thing we have as the city of Boston. $600 million, as Councilor Janey and Councilor Wu noted in their housing, or in their hearing on city contracts. So when we go to have contracts with employers, with contractors, with businesses out there, to note, we don't appreciate specific practices that would exclude your employees from employment if they have a bad credit score, that their credit score should be even a part of that conversation, right? And saying that, you know, if we're going to get a bunch of these folks who are going to be vendors for the city of Boston to the tune of $600 million, our city dollars are passing into those employees, ultimately into their paychecks, right? And so just basically saying, part of our policy when we're contracting is that we're going to look at how you put up obstacles to employment. And if it's got something to do with the credit score, we don't agree with that. And the city of Boston could lead again without legislation by saying that, though this legislation could also require that as well. And then finally, I agree with the working session, especially because I think it's important, as Avandra brought up, to get employers beyond the city of Boston in this conversation. You know, I am curious, what's the opposition's argument? I don't know. I can't think of one right now, but I mean, I'm sure they may have something, and whatever argument they have, that we couldn't come up with a balanced exception to help them with whatever supposed need that they have. But I do agree that we need to have a working session for that argument and make space for that. And I think we can balance it with this legislation, as expansive as it is. But I don't see how we couldn't come up with a way to balance those interests. So a working session is to come to work within these things, and hearing that there is no opposition, or that there's, you know, that the lead sponsors don't mind credit scores being removed or as part of housing policy or something, we can come up with that legislation as well. I think there's already protected categories, and I think we're just creating, you know, one more form. I don't know if we're creating a protected category so much as saying that this can't be used to discriminate otherwise qualified individuals for housing or employment. That might be the language we need to kind of play with. But I'm excited for it. I think this is something, you know, I rarely trumpet something in the middle of the hearing. I try to be neutral, but this is so necessary, and the amount of people whose credit scores are impacted by this moment, living off their credit cards right now to pay bills, living off trying to pay rent when they can't pay their utilities. I mean, this is about how people are going to rebound from this moment as well in the city of Boston. So Nadine, as I mentioned, I would have you kind of come in after, summarize your thoughts about credit scores. I think one of the things we really are looking forward to is, you know, how much this impacts or is used as, I would call it, a discriminatory tool, really in place of race sometimes even.
Well, thank you, Councilor Edwards, and really thank all of you. I'm honored to be invited. I know I've worked with a lot of you over the years, and you really are the leadership of our city, and I so appreciate it. And I'm also sorry I was late. There is so much going on that's impacting low-income people. I can't keep everything straight. So this is a really critical issue, and 1 in 4 residents in Massachusetts has a debt in collection. And when you look at communities of color, that almost doubles. So the impact on people is really great. If you have a debt in collection, your credit score is totally shot. This is an issue that we have tried to work on for so many years. I worked with Byron Rushing for many years on state legislation where we tried to get a similar bill passed, and we had a big coalition with the National Consumer Law Center, the ACLU, the National Employment Lawyers Association, and amazingly enough, we were never able to get that passed on the state. And I must say, I'm really encouraged to see all of you focusing on this now, because it's something that I think is critical. And if we can't get it done now, when can we get it done? I mean, this is the most critical time. And I think, you know, you probably know the statistics more than I. Haven't been looking at this closely enough, but probably more than 50% of employers do credit checks in employment. And for jobs that don't, you know, involve dealing with money or, you know, anything where it should matter at all. And I think what Councillor Edwards says, it really is in some way a pretext for discrimination. And I think the city really has an obligation to ensure that any of the companies that they're doing business with do not use credit scores to discriminate against job applicants. And, you know, we're living in such impossibly difficult times that to keep someone who might be able to get a job from not getting that job because they had been laid off and had a hard time paying their credit card bills, that just really doesn't make sense. So what I would like to offer, I have not read your bill really carefully. I've looked at it. It looks great. I would love to pull out the old state legislation and compare it and maybe add some pieces that maybe are not in here. And but on behalf of the low-income clients of GBLS, and I will tell you probably 90% of them have lousy credit scores, if not 100%. And those are the people who need jobs the most. And if we're prohibiting them from getting it, I think that's shame on us. So I would be very happy to work with you all. And I'm sorry I'm not more prepared now, but we gave testimony at the state. I remember I gave testimony at the State House. It must be, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago now. And the other thing, and I think you all know this, that many other states, New York and California and others, do have similar legislation. When we were working on ours, I'm pretty sure New York City passed similar legislation. So I will pull out all my old materials, and I'd love to work with you on it and, you know, help in any way that I really can. And thank you again for everything you guys do.
Thank you. Councillor Janey?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nadine, for being here and for all of your work over the many years on this important issue and on the many important issues. I know I've had the pleasure of working with you, as many of my colleagues have as well. You know, one, I'd be interested just in more little nuggets. So you've offered the 1 in 4 in Boston have a debt in collection, and that doubles for communities of color. If there are other data points, though that was part of the earlier discussion in the hearing, some of our colleagues were looking for more of those nuggets, and not that you have to recite a bunch of stuff now, but if there was something that you could submit to this committee so that we could get it out to all the colleagues, I think that would be helpful. The other thing is that you offered to kind of look up this legislation that you and Representative Rushing were working on years ago to kind of do the side-by-side comparison. And I was just wondering your thoughts in terms of timing, as I know the chair of this committee is anxious to reconvene and have a working session. And I think that might be a good place to kind of get any of those gaps. If you see that there are gaps missing that might be in that state legislation that is not here, that's going to be the place to really have that kind of in the weeds conversation. So I just wanted to get a sense from you on timing as to when you thought that could be, so that this committee could reconvene and we could make sure that we're moving forward legislation. And not to put pressure or rush. I know we're all busy. Just wanted to get a sense so that the committee could then plan.
I'd love to say right away, and I will try to do as much as I can, but there's a little election coming up, and I'm doing some voter protection work in Florida, and somehow they gave me this big job, and so I'm really I have to focus a little bit on that. I have the Panhandle County, so it's very odd, but I will. What's your time frame? I mean, I'll try to do as I just have to get my old files together and look at it.
I would ask my co-sponsor and the chair of the committee to chime in on the time, just to follow up on Ms. Cohen's question.
If just note that the election is in 2 weeks or so. And then we have probably a couple weeks of hearings to get stuff done. We take Thanksgiving week off, and then we have 2 weeks in December, and then our session is over. So, I am committed to having the working session to allow for people who disagree or would like another exception to have that conversation. So what might be helpful, Nadine, is if you go ahead and give us the link or at least a copy of that draft of legislation. I don't expect a memo or anything, just the thing, and highlight, what you think is very important in that. It might already be in Council Jane.
It might be.
But if we can go from there, and then also, what we've been doing, like with AFFH, we have conversations, we talk, and then we bring that conversation to the public, so we get a lot of the work done. I would encourage you to do the same, you or with the staff sub or directly with the counselors, Campbell and Janey, to move this along. But I even just knowing that we probably really have very little, 6-7 weeks of real work to get this done.
Yeah, I'll try to do it as soon as I can.
Thank you, Nadine. So counselors, we can go back on a second round of questions. Counselor Campbell has her hand raised, and I would encourage all the other counselors who have questions or would like another set of questions to ask to raise their hands. It's about 2:34, excuse me. So I tend to want to run, finish at 3.
Yeah, so, no, you're right, Counselor. Want to be respectful of folks' time, particularly the administration, for staying on. Really appreciate it. No, we have, I think, in a previous file, that Byron, was absolutely a leader with respect to this legislation. We had Pauline come to our 2016 hearing. GBLS has been at the forefront of this issue for a long time and was very helpful in that 2016 hearing. And frankly, the hiccup was legal. Our corporation counsel kind of pushing back on what we could file, what we couldn't file. We made some edits in this version, and that would allow for some of those legal barriers or potential barriers to go away, and came up with a better version that I think could work at the city level, while the state, frankly, drags its feet, could work legally at the city level. So Nadine, I think what would be helpful is any file you send, not just draft legislation, but of course, information. So a lot of the data we have is from 2016, is from that hearing. But if you have any additional information, that would be helpful. Or if you have any information, even if it's just through conversations with advocates in other cities, it's been more difficult to track down, New York, Philly, they've actually passed legislation back in 2016, great. has anyone had meaningful conversations in the advocacy world around the effect of that legislation? That's a question that continues to come up where we're still digging and not necessarily getting the responses we would like. And so any information you could bring with respect to that would be very, very helpful. But for me, I'm all for getting this done. We've been talking about this for years. There was some legal hiccups, but I think we have gotten past those and over those. And now it's just a question of whether or not the administration and the mayor would be supportive of this. And if we have time to loop in some of the other things we've heard with respect to evictions in the housing crisis, and of course, wanting to get more employers to participate in this conversation, or at least to let us know what their opposition might be. So that working session is great. The only thing I've really heard, at least recently, 2016 it came up, but recently, is employers who have concerns around taking this metric away or this criteria away as a way in which to determine someone's character or how they'll show up on the job. And I just pushed back on that. I mean, but that has been a concern that continues to come up. And I'm saying, point to some study or some evidence you've used where this actually is true. And I have yet to receive such information. And I think if we as a city of Boston, as Vivian talked about earlier, can be taking the lead and not using this information, and clearly our employees are doing, I think, quite well, then we should hold other employers to the same standard. So happy to participate in that working session, of course, Madam Chair. I'm done talking. This is great. And thank you to all the folks from the administration for being on here for so long. And thank you, Nadine, for joining us. I know how swamped you are, so thank you.
Thank you, Councilor.
Oh, and thank you to my Chief of Staff, Ellie, who was navigating all of this and all the moving pieces. So thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Braden raised her hand.
Thank you. I've been Googling and researching while we're listening to all this. I see that in July of 2019, the House Financial Services Committee, led by Maxine Waters of California, considered restricting the use of credit cards for employment credit reports, credit checks for Employment Decisions Act. That might be another source of some good data, some good information that we could draw into this conversation.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much, Councilor Braden.
And I would say, no, you're exactly right. There's a lot of information there, and also from Senator Warren's office. Some of it's a little old and national, but very useful. But Senator Warren also was a leader on this, and they helped us with a lot of data as well. So thank you for your email, Liz. I saw it.
Thank you. I have to jump off for another meeting, so thank you so much, and consider me on board for moving this forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So just a note for folks, the working session, I'm just taking notes, we'll be discussing employer concerns beyond the city of Boston, how this can or cannot be married with some housing protections, removing credit scores or credit checks as a means of housing. And indirectly, I'd probably get some of the eviction as well, because evictions impact your credit score as well. So this might help. Then there's the city policy in general. Hopefully we can get some information about our IDP policy. As Councilor Bach noted, when we're doing lotteries and IDP policies, your credit score is analyzed for the affordable units. I brought up city contracting with employers and how we should be letting them know, you contract with the city of Boston, this is not a criteria we appreciate you using on your employees. And then finally, just in general, if we can get some background for state, city, and federal policy to help us really construct the best version of that here. And I think that's a good amount of work to get done in the working session and also in many conversations in between, so that, again, we shine this to be the brightest light that we can make with this ordinance and present to our colleagues before the end of the year. Unless anybody else is raising their blue hand to make additional comments or questions, I could close out today's session and we'll get right to work into making sure that this is the brightest one. All of the folks from the city, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate you taking the time, and we know you are in the position of you're committed to do the work. I'll say that. You can't make a commitment overall for the administration, but what we see in your hearts and you're being here today, you are committed to do the work. So thank you for that. Thank you, Nadine, for coming as well. Again, I'm going to go ahead and conclude unless I get a blue hand. Once, twice, 3 times. Okay, no blue hands. All right, guys. Thank you so much for your time. Take care.